And I thought and thought and thought about it. Okay. And then I went back to my office and I thought for 2 more days. And then I hit on the agreement theorem. Okay. Agreeing to disagree is impossible.
That was Nobel Laureate Professor Robert Aumann describing the moment 50 years ago when he came up with the Aumann Agreement Theorem. It's an amazing proposition which states that rational, truth-seeking people should never agree to disagree. I'm Victor Hagani, and together with my partner and co-author James White, we've had the privilege of learning about the Aumann Agreement Theorem directly from Professor Aumann himself. Have you ever read a book that left you thinking about the story way after you put the book down? For me, that's been going on for the last 7 years. But instead of a story that's lingered in my mind, it's this deep and very optimistic theorem. I came across this big idea in a book aptly titled The Big Questions by one of my favorite economists, Professor Stephen Landsberg. I immediately got a copy of Aumann's 3-page article, Agreeing to Disagree, where he describes the agreement theorem and lays out its mathematical proof. Now, some of the math was over my head, but Aumann and Landsberg's plain language explanations made sense to me. What followed were many, many hours discussing the agreement theorem with pretty much any friend or family member who was willing to listen. To my surprise, no one had ever heard of it, but everyone thought it was surprising and important.
Back when Victor and I became business partners in 2018, one of the first principles we established was that we were going to work really hard to never agree to disagree on the important stuff. So when we started digging into Alman's work, there was a real thrill, an immediate feeling that this was something powerful and relevant to our daily lives. And it seems like there's no better time to be asking ourselves what it takes to achieve agreement, mostly for the obvious reason that we're living through a time of disturbing and dangerous disagreement and polarization, but also because this year is the 50th anniversary of Professor Aumann's aha moment when he first formulated the agreement theorem. At that time, he was on the mathematics faculty of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, having arrived in Israel in 1956, just after receiving his PhD in math from MIT. That move had actually been his second emigration. The first came decades earlier, in 1930, when his family fled their native Germany for the United States just 2 weeks before the Kristallnacht pogrom. At 95 years old, Professor Aumann is one of the most influential game theorists and economists of our time. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2005, alongside Thomas Schelling, for his groundbreaking contributions to game theory and our understanding of conflict and cooperation.
Professor Aumann's work reminds us that achieving agreement isn't a sign of groupthink or conformity. It's what rational communication looks like when it's working the way it should. It's what it really means to respect one another and to think together. Please settle in for what we hope you'll find an intellectually stimulating and entertaining journey with one of the great minds of our time. So with that, welcome, Professor Aumann, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay, my pleasure.
Professor, can we kick things off just by asking you to explain the Aumann agreement theorem in your own words?
Okay, well, the paper was called Agreeing to Disagree, and because that's a common phrase, and actually, the paper showed that agreeing to disagree is impossible. Okay. It's impossible. If people are totally logical, they don't have to agree on whether they like Bach or jazz better. Okay, that's not the point. But on facts and beliefs about facts, okay, they cannot agree to disagree. Okay.
So just to be clear, we're not talking about irrational thinkers, and we're not talking about opinions. What Professor Aumann is saying is that if two people start with the same basic assumptions about how the world works, and they trust each other to be logical, and they honestly share their beliefs with each other, then eventually They must end up with identical beliefs. They must agree.
Okay, so Professor Aumann, can you please give us an example to illustrate how the agreement theorem works?
So there are two detectives, okay? And these two detectives, they go to the same detective school, okay? So their methods are the same, okay? The methods are the same. Now, some very important person is murdered, okay? And it's a mystery who did it. And the chief of police, he puts two detectives on it, okay? And he tells them, I want you guys to work independently, okay? And not to talk to each other, not to say, give any clues to each other, okay? Work separately, completely separately, okay? And then make an arrest. In 30 days, they have decided who to arrest, okay? Detective A is going to arrest Mr. Alpha, and Detective B is going to arrest Mrs. Beta, okay? Now, and they've made up their minds, but they didn't talk to each other. Now, they happened to meet in the locker room, okay? And they, they were told by the commissioner not to give any clues to each other. But they're taking a shower in the locker room, and they said, well, the police commissioner didn't tell us not to tell each other who we are going to arrest. He just said not to give any substantive information to each other, okay? And so, A asks B, who are you going to arrest? Okay. And B says, Mrs. Beta. And he said, but no, well, who are you going to arrest? And A says, Mr. Alpha, okay. They start scratching their heads, okay. And they say, well, maybe you're right, because why maybe you're right? Because you're just as rational and smart as me. You're a good thinker, okay? And and so maybe without knowing why you're going to arrest Mrs. Beta, okay? Uh, I give you credit, okay? And uh, and B says the same thing, yeah. And they start talking to each other, and they don't exchange any information, no substantive information. So A says, you know what, I think maybe you're right. I'm going to arrest Mrs. Beta also, but you don't know everything that I know, okay? So putting two and two together, I'm going to arrest Gamma, okay? And so on and so forth. There's a conversation there in the locker room, never giving any substantive clues. Just, I'm going to arrest Beta, Gamma, Delta, Alpha, Beta. In the end, yes, when nobody has anything more to say, they're going to arrest the same person. Okay? They're going to arrest the same
They're
person.
going to agree.
And
They're going to agree with each other.
the reason is, I'm not going to give you the mathematical proof, yes, because it's mathematical. Yes, it's not deep. The mathematical proof is not deep, but it is tricky. Okay, it is tricky.
The paper that Professor Aumann published is worth seeing because it's kind of radical in just how short it is. Okay, so here's the 3-page article. The first page discusses the theorem in plain language. Now we see the mathematical proof. It's tricky and clever. And then there's another page of plain language discussion and intuition.
It makes sense because the fact that A says he's going to arrest Alpha, yes, is a clue to B who to arrest. He doesn't know why he said it, but it's a clue, okay? And so on. And they cannot have common knowledge of arresting a different person. It's impossible.
We think it'll be worth a few minutes to work through another example of how the agreement theorem would work in practice. Okay, imagine an urn containing 100 balls. Some are red and the rest are black, but the mix is equally likely to be anything from all red to all black. Now, James and I are going to independently develop our beliefs about how many red balls are in the urn. And then we'll see how our beliefs converge in agreement, as Aumann would predict. First, James and I will each go separately into a room and pull balls out of the urn, replacing each one and then pulling out another, until each one of us is told to stop. James and I have a common understanding of how the game will work, and we don't expect to get to see the same number of balls. Okay, so James goes in first, and he's allowed to sample 50 balls from the urn, and 37 times he pulls out a red ball. When it's my turn, I'm only allowed to pull 10 balls out, and I get 4 red and 6 black. Okay, so how will we agree on a joint estimate without telling each other how many times we got to pull a ball from the urn? Our dialogue might go something like this. We start by telling each other our initial belief. James says, I think 74 balls in the urn are red, and I say, I think only 40 of the balls are red. Our individual estimates are in line with what we saw. James got to pull a ball out 50 times, so he's thinking his estimate is pretty accurate, and so he suspects that I didn't get to see so many balls given my estimate is so far from his. So James isn't too persuaded by my estimate, and he moves his estimate down by just 5, saying he now thinks the urn has 69 red balls in it. I'm not too confident of my estimate since I only got to see 10 balls, so I move my belief a much bigger amount, all the way from 40 to 64 red balls. Okay, we tell each other our updated estimates again. My big move confirms to James that I didn't see many balls, and at the same time, I realize James's belief is pretty strong because he didn't move much. So when we both move again, James moves down by just 1 to a belief that 68 of the balls are red, but I'm more persuaded by James's sharp estimate, so I move up from 64 to 66. It takes just one more round of exchanging our updated estimates for us to converge at a belief that the urn has 67 red balls in it. We created this example based on there being 70 red balls in the urn, so our final agreed-upon estimate wasn't on the money. But the important thing is that we did reach agreement, and we did it without having had to share all of the information that each of us had based our beliefs on. Of course, in the real world, we could have reached agreement right away by just telling each other how many balls we actually drew. But the power, or maybe I should say, the magic of Aumann's agreement theorem is that people don't need to have all the information on which the other person's belief is based. That's really important for real-world use because the nature of real-world disagreements is that even people who are trying to work together often can't have full knowledge of absolutely everything the other person's belief is based on.
This is also a great example to illustrate an important implication of the agreement theorem for gambling and trading in financial markets. If Victor and I are both acting rationally, there's no bet that both of us should be willing to accept on how many of the balls in the urn are red. We both have private information, how many balls we drew, and I should feel that any trade Victor would happily accept should be a bad trade for me, and he should feel that any trade I'd happily accept should be bad for him. This insight was applied to financial markets by another Nobel laureate and game theorist, Paul Milgram, who, along with Nancy Stokey, proved their no-trade theorem for a very specific set of strong assumptions, using Professor Aumann's agreement theorem as their jumping-off point. We discussed this with Professor Aumann, and he pointed out that in both theory and practice, there are lots of valid reasons for trading, from people having different risk aversion, to someone just wanting to get their annual bonus invested in the market, or needing to sell some stock to buy a house. And these trades are done without expressing a view on the market price. However, the important insight from Aumann is that if both sides of a trade are rational, they shouldn't be making market bets based on private information. That's the main reason why so many financial economists view the enormous trading volume we see in financial markets, and more recently in sports betting markets, is both puzzling and disturbing.
Okay, getting back to the agreement theorem again. At the heart of the theorem is the idea of common knowledge, which sounds simple, but it's a little bit more nuanced than you might think. Let's hear Professor Aumann explain it.
Now, I have to explain what common knowledge means. Okay, but that is the essential part of the story. Um, Common knowledge does not mean that uh, that you know X and I know X. It doesn't mean that. That's called mutual knowledge. Okay, common knowledge means that I know X and you know X. Moreover, you know that I know X. Okay, and I know that you know X. Okay. Moreover, that the previous statements are known to both of us. Okay, so I know that you know X. You know that I know X. We both know it, and you know that, and I know that, and you know that, and I know that, and so on ad infinitum.
Now let's travel back a half a century to 1975 and hear about how Professor Aumann came up with his simple but amazingly important insight.
It came about this way. You know, game theory is based on the idea of equilibrium, equilibrium play. Now, equilibrium means that if I knew how the other people are going to play, then I would be maximizing against that. John Nash, have you heard that name?
Yes.
Of
Okay.
course.
He won a Nobel Prize also, and he was really a genius. And and before that, von Neumann, okay, devised that idea of a randomized strategy. And Nash proved that every game, no matter how many players it has, yes, has an equilibrium in randomized strategy. Okay. All right. Now, in the early 70s, I started thinking to myself, well, what happens if we don't use objective randomizations, like tossing a coin or something like that, or spinning a roulette wheel, but we use subjective randomizations, like betting on a horse in a horse race, okay? Uh, so people could disagree about the probabilities. You're not going to disagree about the probability of a coin coming up heads. That's half. Yeah, that's it. Okay. But about which horse is going to come in first, there could be an argument. Okay. So I published a paper about that. And in the end of the paper, in the discussion section, okay, I said, wait a minute, maybe is that really possible? Okay. Is it really possible to to the to base your choice of a strategy on horse races, and you know each other's probabilities. Okay, and I went and I discussed this. I remember this vividly. I discussed it with Kenneth Arrow and Frank Hahn. Now there was a tradition. This happened in the decade of the 70s and the 80s. Every summer for 20 years, there was a meeting of the greatest minds in economics. It was absolutely wonderful. Okay. Every summer for 20 years, I went from Jerusalem to uh, Stanford. Okay. And one day I went to Frank's office and Kenneth was there. And I explained to them my problems with this, the conceptual problems with this idea of subjectively mixed strategies. And I thought and thought and thought about it. Okay. And then I went back from that meeting, three of us. I went back to my office and I thought for 2 more days. And then I hit on the agreement theorem. Okay. Agreeing to disagree is impossible. You can't have subjectively mixed strategies, yeah, because that would mean that somebody else is aware of the fact that you're attributing a different probability than I am, and there's common knowledge of those probabilities. It's impossible.
Isn't it so inspiring to think that Professor Aumann came to the agreement theorem by changing his mind about an idea that he based an earlier piece of work on? As we've learned more about Professor Aumann's work, we've seen that it's led to thousands of other research articles, many of them extending it to other areas, from financial markets to politics to the justice system. And other articles, such as We Can't Disagree Forever or Are Disagreements Honest, have explored what happens when we relax the assumptions that the agreement theorem is based on. What we've learned is that the agreement principle is pretty robust to relaxing most of its assumptions.
However, one assumption that has been hotly debated is the one that states that we have to have a shared view of how the world works before we start to form our beliefs about the topic we're trying to reach agreement on. This starting point is referred to as having the same prior beliefs, which we often refer to simply as priors. Let's hear what Professor Aumann has to say about the matter, specifically whether the assumption that people have shared priors is realistic and reasonable.
Prior is not the result of any event or anything like that. Prior is you're born with it, or maybe the human race has a prior. I think different priors is it's a sort of copping out. Okay, an equivalent way of stating the common prior assumption is if two people, yeah, if two people are given exactly the same information. They have the same information, okay? We're not talking about the situation of the two detectives who do not have the same information, yes. But if we make the assumption that the two detectives are given the same information, okay, then the common prior assumption is equivalent to saying that if they have the same information exactly and the same education exactly, then they will arrest the same person. Okay, now that makes a lot of sense. Okay, as a thing. Yes, we want a situation where your decision is based on your information only, only. Okay, so if you have this, the assumption is if you have the same information, then you will make the same decision. Okay, and that is equivalent to common priors.
Wow, that is very simple and very powerful. Thank you.
Okay. Trying to work with different priors is copping out. Different priors, you can do anything with different priors. Let me read you a section of a paper I wrote about Kenneth Arrow in the 70s. Arrow was having a birthday or something like that, and I wrote a paper about mathematical method and economic analysis. Let me see if I can find here. Here it is. I found it. My criterion for judging any piece of science is how effective it is, where it leads, whether it leads to insights, to a considerable body of work, to better understanding. There are two different criteria. One is how plausible are the assumptions? The other is, where do the conclusions lead? Many people use the first criterion, a priori plausibility of the model, as a criterion for judging a piece of work. But I prefer the second criterion. Where does it lead? The usual assumptions of utility maximization have led to practically all of economic theory, and at least some of that helps us to understand the world. The idea of satisficing and other ideas of that kind that abandon the model of full rationality are extremely attractive as hypotheses.
We want to pause here for a second to explain what Professor Aumann is referring to when he uses the term satisficing. Satisficing is the idea from behavioral economics that people don't try to rationally make the best or optimal decisions for themselves, but that they just settle for a decision that's good enough or just okay. Professor Aumann is contrasting satisficing with the objective of maximizing expected utility, which sits at the heart of much economic theory.
If I asked myself, do I satisfice or do I maximize utility? I have to answer that I satisfice. Okay. So the concept is very attractive as an assumption, but I do not know of any general conclusions to which it leads. It is not that the concept cannot lead to anything. A coherent model of bounded rationality could very well lead to interesting results. But up until now, they have not led to any significant body of theory or indeed to anything very startling. Okay. So it's where it leads, where it goes to, where you're going. Not is it plausible or is it not plausible.
You know, you've been so generous with your time, Professor Aumann. This has so far exceeded our already high expectations, and we know it's late at night in Jerusalem also. So maybe we should ask our final question. As you look to the future, what gives you hope?
Well, I want to answer that on two levels, okay? I think on the universal level, I try to be hopeful. I wish the world should pay more attention to being to the green principle. Okay, so biodiversity, the number of species that are being destroyed annually is just is terrible. Yeah, that's what I want. And I would dearly love the peace in the Middle East, people loving each other, respecting each other. Maybe loving each other is too much to ask, but respecting each other and live and let live. Okay.
Those are wonderful, wonderful aspirations for us. Yeah, may they come to pass, both.
Okay. So it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was a real honor.
We'll be in touch.
What an amazing conversation with Professor Aumann. After listening to him, we believe more than ever that the agreement theorem has profound implications for how we approach disagreements in our own lives, especially when they're disagreements on empirical beliefs about the future. The agreement theorem and the huge body of work it sparked show us what the path looks like for rationally resolving disagreement. And for people genuinely interested in the truth, just knowing that agreement should be possible can remove one of the biggest hurdles to actually achieving that agreement.
Thank you so much, Professor Aumann, for your generosity with your time and your remarkable clarity in explaining these complex ideas. The Aumann Agreement Theorem isn't just an abstract mathematical theorem. It's a blueprint for how rational minds can work together toward truth. In a world which is way too often divided by seemingly intractable disagreements, the Aumann Agreement Theorem offers both a challenge and a hope. That when searching for truth, rational minds can indeed meet together. Thank you for joining us for this conversation, and thank you, Professor Aumann, for a lifetime of insights that continue to illuminate how we can think and reason together more effectively.